Hi, everybody. We're really excited to be here today. I'm Elizabeth Wilson. I'm the director of the Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth. And with colleagues at, I think it's now up to 18 other universities, we're hosting a series focused on postdocs, assistant professors, new energy research to hear about the cutting work in the field and also to give our younger colleagues a chance to really show their stuff to a larger audience. And I want to thank you all today for signing up. There were over 101 people signing up, and I want to pass it over now to Valerie Karplus from MIT and after September 1st, Carnegie Mellon, who will be moderating today's session. So thank you, everybody. I'll be back at the end to talk about events coming up in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you, Elizabeth. It's a pleasure to be here. I indeed will be changing this background on September 1st to Carnegie Mellon's Engineering and Public Policy Department. I'm very excited. Now on to the order of the day, which is, I think you'll find a very stimulating talk from Bjarne Steffen on the role of finance in the low carbon energy transition. I think this is a tremendously important topic, especially now as there's a lot of economic uncertainty on the horizon. And so I think we'll have a lot to learn and in ways of informing our thinking going forward in terms of where the low carbon energy transition will go next. Just to introduce Bjarne, Bjarne Steffen is a senior researcher within the Energy Politics Group at ETH Zurich in Switzerland and a lecturer at the Institute of Science, Technology and Policy, also at ETH Zurich. His research addresses policies for low carbon innovation, and he's particularly interested in the role of financial actors, in particular investors and banks, in the ongoing sustainable energy transition and the role of the state in finance and the energy sectors more generally. To this end, he works at the intersection of economics, political science, and innovation studies, so true interdisciplinary scholar. And I had the pleasure of getting to know Bjarne when he came almost a year ago, spent time at MIT in working with me and MIT's Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research. He's also worked previously for the World Economic Forum and the Boston Consulting Group, and he holds a master's in economics from the University of Mannheim and a PhD in energy economics from the University of Duisburg-Essen. And so it's my great pleasure to turn the floor over to Bjarne. He'll talk for about 30 minutes, and we'll ask that you hold your questions till the end of the talk, at which point we'll go to the Q&A window and take questions. I believe you can second questions so that they will move to the top of the list. Hopefully you'll all be able to enter your questions directly into the chat window. We will wrap up just about 12:55. So with that, it's my great pleasure to turn the floor over to Bjarne, and thank you all very much for coming.
Great, thanks a lot, Valerie and Elizabeth. Welcome from my side. Greatly appreciate having the chance to present today. I think this is a great format to keep the academic discourse going. I really enjoyed the last session with Gabe Chen, and so I'm very much looking forward to presenting and to the discussion we're going to have today. Like we said, I'm an energy policy scholar. Since some years, I dedicate part of my time to studying energy finance. And today I want to make the case why I think understanding finance is important in research on the energy transition, and present what I think are the key insights that we gained in our team at ETH Zurich over the last 2 years or so, concerning what is special in renewable energy finance and what are intervention points for public policy. And these are outcomes from work from a number of empirical studies with a team that includes 2 PhD students, Florian Egli and Anna Geddes, Professor Tobias Schmidt, and myself. For starters, I should say that when I say renewable energy finance and research on renewable energy finance, that is pretty different from energy finance in general. That's what I learned when I first went to energy finance sessions at energy economics conferences, for instance. This is typically mainly about fuel prices, about oil and gas trading, hedging, and so on, which makes sense, which is not surprising because in conventional energy systems, the fuel costs, they're just a very important component of the cost of final energy, such as electricity. It's in some calculation we did, it's about 85% of the levelized cost of electricity that go into fuel. And so efficient trading and pricing of fuels matter for the economy. In renewable energy then, finance is different. The cost is, of course, it's not in the fuel, but it's in the upfront investment. So what matters from a finance perspective is then how to finance the assets. For solar and wind, you have CapEx, and then besides you have the cost of capital, who kind of replace the cost of fuel as a key driver for electricity cost. So in this chart here, that's for solar and wind, the cost of equity, that's the return to shareholders, and the cost of debt, the interest payments, together they make up about a third of the levelized cost of electricity. A much bigger share than in fossil fuel-based electricity. This comes with a number of implications. One, an obvious one, the investment need, so the total amount of capital that has to be financed upfront is much higher for renewables, for other low carbon technologies as well. I think that's the reason why finance always features so prominently in COP climate conferences, for instance. And second, maybe not that obvious, because of renewable energy technologies being so capital intensive, the cost of electricity for renewables is also very sensitive to the cost of capital. This is the right-hand side, some very simple calculation showing that if you go with the weighted average cost of capital from some hypothetical 0 to something in the region of 10%, you double the cost of electricity. So from a policy perspective, you not only have to care about whether enough capital is available, but also at which cost. Empirically, I think it's very clear by now that the cost of capital varies a lot. It varies between countries, it varies between technologies, conventional fuels, renewables, also within renewable energy technologies. It varies over time. Here, pick one case to illustrate the relevance of such differences between countries. You may know the academic debate on 100% renewable energy system. One result you often see in these studies, on the left-hand side, there's an example here from the Christian Breyer team, is that electricity from renewables, it's cheapest in sunny countries, in very sunny countries like Sudan or Democratic Republic of Congo in this example. And more expensive, sometimes very much more expensive in moderate insulation countries, for instance, in Europe. So these results, they are happily taken up then by narratives that claim, for instance, that it is uneconomical to build solar in moderate insulation countries such as Europe. However, obviously such modeling results, they reflect assumptions, including and often implicit finance assumptions, which is you have uniform cost of capital everywhere, which in terms of country differences is of course very unrealistic. In reality, they differ a lot. So building on one of these 100% renewable energy studies, we tried to estimate realistic cost of capital that take into account country risk, came up with numbers for renewable energy projects between 25% in Sudan and 3% in Switzerland. And if you take these realistic financing assumptions, then the ranking of countries in terms of cost of capital completely flips around. That is implications, of course, for the discourse, for policy. It means that in moderate insulation countries, in Switzerland, for instance, it can actually be very economical to deploy solar PV, even with moderate insulations, if the cost of capital are low. And second, it also means that for regions like large parts of Africa, for instance, where cost of capital are really high at the moment, if you want to make large-scale deployment of renewables reality there, then reducing the cost of capital for projects in these countries should be a key priority. So much I want to say about why I think finance matters for renewables, and it's worth better understanding the role of finance for the transition to renewables. In doing so, in our research, Valerie said that we have pretty interdisciplinary approach, and also like the three of us with our backgrounds. We can build, of course, a lot on general financial economics. That's a bit the background I bring also to the table there. Though we found that some aspects, they are very special for renewables, and they're also important, we think. And so I want to discuss two of them. One is the financing structures being used for projects, and the second is the dynamics of cost of capital for energy projects over time. Starting with the financing structures, very basic from a financial economics point of view, companies have two options for new capital investments. They can either take these investments on their balance sheet using corporate finance, stocks and bonds, about 90% of the global capital market. That's the mainstream approach if you want. Or alternatively, that's the second option. You can create a special purpose vehicle in SPV and use project finance. With loans on the level of the SPV only, without recourse to the project sponsors. Like on the big picture of global capital markets, that's a niche. That's a very small share of capital investment. Also because it typically comes at high transaction cost. You have to set up these SPV. You have to reveal a lot of information about the SPV for lenders being willing to lend to that. And to that end, project finance is mainly used for large-scale investments that are so risky that companies do not want to contemplate. Given this like general perspective from financial economics, it's surprising that project finance actually plays a pretty important role for renewables. Some estimates put it at 50% globally of all renewable energy finance going through project finance. In industrial countries, it's probably even much higher, the share. We did a detailed study with collecting financial data for 250 planned projects in Germany, for instance. That's in the middle here. We picked Germany because that's a country first where a lot of power plants have been built across all technologies, but also because it's a country which has a very low risk environment for renewable energy investments. There's a fixed feed-in tariff that's guaranteed for renewable energy. Typically, a lot of these projects, they are also small compared to conventional power plant projects in the country. So from traditional point of view, one would not expect project finance being used a lot. However, as you see in these figures, it's tremendously important. It's about 96% of all utility scale solar PV projects. It's 88% of wind projects that use project finance. And we tested various hypotheses from financial theory why we could see this pattern, what could be the reason, and concluded that the key reason for such widespread use of project finance, I think it applies to many other countries as well, is the debt overhang of project sponsors that brought forward these projects. So unlike in gas plants and coal plants, a lot of renewable energy plants, they are developed by new entrants to the capital market, new entrants to the energy market, I'm sorry. So it could be independent project developers, it could be financial investors that newly enter into energy finance, energy asset finance. And these are players which often are rapidly growing and which do not have balance sheets that are large enough to allow them to finance it via corporate finance. So the only way for them to maintain their growth and to grow their portfolio is to go via the project finance route. This has important implications for pretty much everything we do on renewable energy finance research. The first thing is because it's project finance, also the cost of capital applies on a project level. So it's the risk structure of the individual project, which comes with a specific technology, that matters for the debt rate that you get. That matters for the cost of debt, that matters for the cost of equity. So it's a project-specific risks and cost of capital that you have to take into account. And the companies that bring forward these projects and their financial solidity and so on matter much less. That's the first implication. The second thing is that for project finance, banks actually play an important role in deciding which projects get financed, which projects is being built, which technologies are viable, but a bigger role as in corporate finance setups, where it's mostly on the corporate level these decisions are taken. So banks are important. And the third implication then, if banks are important and cost of capital is determined on a project level, then also for public policy, it means that the ultimate cost of renewable electricity is affected by a number of regulations which are seemingly more in the financial sphere, like regulation that affect who can invest at all in these kind of projects. If you need to have tax equity, for instance. Regulations that affect the transaction cost for project finance, and more generally everything that determines how conducive the project finance ecosystem in a country is. So this is kind of a different type of policy that also matters then as compared to what one would have typically in mind. The second speciality about renewable energy finance I'd like to mention is what we learned when we looked at, given that cost of capital they apply on the project level, how do they actually develop over time, and what dynamics could we observe? Because we saw that the capital expenditure, for instance, the capex, the investment cost from projects, they changed dramatically over time. They came down significantly for solar, for wind. So what about the cost of capital for such projects? This is charts I showed, some figures from a mixed method study we did for Germany, the United Kingdom, and Italy. Just show Germany here for simplicity, but patterns are pretty much the same. We collected project finance data from 20 banks that finance these projects. And we see in a nutshell, there's a downward trend. There's a massive reduction in cost of capital for both technologies. For both, for PV going down from about 5% in the early 2000s to 1.6%. For wind going down from 4.5% to 1.9%. And this being driven both by higher debt shares, so bigger leverage of projects, and a lower cost of debt for the debt financing part of those projects. So what are the drivers behind this development that we could observe in the past? To study that, we combined these analysis with interviews. We did interviews with about 40 investors from those banks and equity investors that provided the data, also with other investors in those 3 countries. And we compiled the list of drivers that we identified into 3 buckets, if you want, on 3 different groups. So first, there's economy-wide drivers related to the general economic development, which don't have much to do with renewables. So during the period we looked at, that was obviously a period of great macroeconomic changes. We had the financial crisis, we had quantitative easing, expensive monetary policy. So the general interest rate level decreased. But then, in addition, there's a couple of drivers that are specific to renewable energy deployment and finance. The first is the technologies maturing over time, becoming more reliable, less risky, also more data available on performance data, on track records, and so on. So it's easier to assess the risk of this project. So the risks came down. These lower risks were easier to assess. And then there's quite some learnings within the renewable energy finance industry. So there's experience effects within banks and equity investors in assessing projects, due diligence processes, for instance, on the industry level with the overall ecosystem, a lot of standardization going on with new investor types entering the market and so on. So that's like a classical learning story, but in renewable energy finance. Given that we have these different drivers, we then tried to, we estimated experience curves for this learning part, and then try to decompose the improvements of cost of capital into its component. And one result from that, that you can see on the right-hand side, it's for Germany again, it's a split of different components in wind and solar cost of capital. And you can see that both components played a role. So the black line, that's a general interest rate level, which massively came down in Germany during that time period, quite comparable in other European countries and in the US. So that's a big improvement. But then also the renewable energy specific markup, if you want. So one measure for that is the debt margin. That's what's shown here. But also the debt share. So the overall leverage of the project showed the development, the equity expectation, and so on. And for the debt margin, this went down from about 2.5% from solar to 1% for solar in the late 2017, I think it was. So this is a quite significant reduction as well. So about 5% reduction general interest level, 1 percentage point reduction in the debt margin. And that together then we estimated accounted for about 25 to 30% of the overall cost improvement that we saw in solar and wind electricity cost over that time. This is, I would say, the second special case of special effect of renewable energy finance is that if you have immature technologies, if you have new technologies, there's other technologies coming up in the energy transition that fall into the same bucket. Then you have changes in financing conditions that also relate to these technologies becoming more mature over time. Whose learnings on the technologies itself becoming more reliable, but then also learnings in the financial industry in financing projects of this technology. And these two factors, I would say, they come into play when we think about what could be a role of public policy here, what could be policy intervention points for renewable energy finance or for financing the energy transition more generally. That is the general interest rate level, and then the renewable energy specific markups, which are reflected in the debt margin and in other financial metrics. So I want to discuss these two. The first is the general interest rates. For the general interest rates, these are driven by macroeconomic developments, obviously by corresponding monetary policy. I think from a renewable energy finance policy point of view, it is mainly important to be aware of the effect that changes in interest rates can have on the economics of renewable energy, and design support policies accordingly. So I want to very briefly show this result from the study that we published at the end of the last year, so before COVID-19 hit, where we looked at what happens, what would happen to the competitiveness of solar and wind if interest rate scenarios change massively. And we looked at different scenarios, starting from where it was 2018, what would be if interest rate levels stay at this level, but what would also happen if they go up again to where they were before the financial crisis. And we see, and that's for all the reasons that I mentioned before, is that renewable energy, they are affected quite heavily by such interest rate fluctuations, interest rate level fluctuations. Look at the solar PV cost. The increase in interest rates could actually stop the trend of falling costs and have costs growing again. Even more so for onshore wind, where we expect less future learning from improvement of the investment cost. And so any interest rate change would hit even stronger. And this has implications for the competitiveness to conventionals, obviously, to fossil fuel-based plants, where now in a couple of European countries, some regions of the US as well. I think renewables, they are pretty much at par with the marginal cost to achieve of fossil fuel-based plants. But with changing interest rate, that might look again very differently. So this is something that should be kept in mind if you design renewable energy support policies. For instance, think about, as Europe does, whether you could phase out renewable energy support policies now, given that their cost competitiveness is good. We say watch out. One has to be aware this can change again with interest rates. And it might be a good idea to design policies in a way that they are thermostatic to react if interest rates react again. With COVID-19 now, obviously the macroeconomic situation changed quite a lot. We recently published a comment on that reached quite some media attention in Europe. Concerning finance of renewable energy, we might see in the coming years quite a different effect on different countries. That's our main story there. So on the one hand side, there are countries where it could be the case that interest rates, they actually stay very low for an extended period of time now. If the quantitative easing continues as it's currently enacted by the central banks, you might see low interest rates for a long time, which opens a window of opportunities for low-cost investment in renewables. We think it's actually so cheap in some countries that in the recovery packages now, where in Europe it's widely being discussed to allocate a lot of money to low-carbon technologies, you might not even have to put it into those mature renewables like solar or wind, because given the low interest rate environment, they anyway are quite convincing investment case already. However, on the other hand, there's other countries. This includes part of the developing world, but also some highly indebted industrialized countries, where given the COVID-19 situation, financing conditions for renewables might actually become worsen a lot. And so one could think about how to cleverly use financial instruments to kind of extend this window of opportunity that you see in some countries to facilitate low-cost renewable energy investment in other countries as well. And I think the recovery package that in Europe is currently proposed by the European Commission, it's controversially debated, but I think in that aspect it has quite some promising ideas proposition. So this is about the monetary policy or the general interest rate part. The other part of the financing cost that I mentioned, which is the renewable energy markups or the renewable energy cost of capital components, that's something that's much closer to renewable energy policymakers, I think. And one policy instrument that's quite popular in the area is state investment banks, or using green state investment banks, which is what we keep analyzing as well. There's interesting developments on the federal state level in the US. Here I want to show some results of 3 state investment banks that have actually been around since 2012. So we have quite some history of investment. That's the KfW Bank in Germany, the Green Investment Bank in the UK, and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation in Australia. And these banks, they spent quite some amounts for renewable energy. It's about 30 billion in Germany, about 50 billion in the UK, 2.5 billion in Australia, with different technologies being targeted. So the purpose of our study here was to understand what exactly are the effects of those investments and what role in the renewable energy finance sphere do banks take with their activities. And to get a grip of that, the first thing that we did, and that's what I'm presenting now, is a qualitative study. It's an interview study with 56 people from those banks, but also from renewable energy developers that received money from those banks, and from commercial banks in 3 countries that compete and cooperate with these state investment banks. And what we found is, yes, the capital provision of these banks played a role. De-risking guarantees that these banks provide, for instance, that played a role. But it's really just one role these banks took in renewable energy finance and developing the market and having experience and learning in the markets, besides many, many others that most of the interviews considered in some even more, way more important. One of them being an educational role in the renewable energy finance sphere by investing to build specialized expertise. All these 3 banks, they had a reputation for being very knowledgeable, for creating new tools to assess risks, for instance, for developing standards that spill from those banks to the industry at large then. These banks, they have an important role in signaling the trust in new technologies. There's a number of documented cases where just the fact that these banks, they joined the financing structure of a certain project brought down the cost of capital for that project. Because a lot of other lenders then came in, they took like the state investment bank participation signal to co-invest, and then in a number of cases, the state investment banks actually, they retracted their support again. They were not needed anymore because there was enough private money available. And finally, that's also what we see in all these 3 countries, is these banks, they took an important role as a first mover with respect to new technologies, more technologies that were new to the country, with respect to new manufacturers and developers, which otherwise would have had a hard time of getting finance for their first project in the country, or for the first project with a new turbine type in wind or so on. So these banks kind of investing the additional effort to assess new project developers, new technologies, and so on, and thereby allowing others to follow and to develop this renewable energy finance ecosystem. So much about state investment banks. Just to mention, we also look at multilateral development banks. Their role in parts of the world cannot be overestimated. We think that's about 60%, for instance, of all wind and solar projects in Africa that saw a multilateral development bank involved. In hydro, you have also about half of all projects across the developing world where these banks are involved. So understanding the role that these banks play, the role that policies for these banks play, is another important aspect as well. So to conclude, I'm looking forward to your question. I hope got a bit across of what we think we learned about renewable energy finance. If I look at it at large, I would say it's a very rewarding work to work on that. It's an emerging field. It's like 4 years ago, there was almost nobody working on that. Now a lot of people are joining the effort, which is great. I feel a great pull from policymakers and industry. Whenever, so we could spend entire days just talking about results and not creating any new, because there's a lot of questions in the sphere. There's challenges in working on these topics. One is the scarcity of data. It's financial data. It's very often confidential. It's not readily available. So for almost all of our studies, a great part of the work is just to collect the data, to get the data from banks. We try to make it available. We published 4 financing data sets now also for other researchers. Maybe a bit of a consequence of this data scarcity is then also that's another challenge. This work, it's a bit in between the fields. It's the financial economics. They're not super interested often in this project finance, in this asset finance area, because data is so scarce, and stock market data is much more readily available. So most people work on that. And in the more engineering and energy transition communities, people didn't think so much about finance so far. We hope to change that. It's also rewarding in a sense, but moving in between fields, that comes with challenges, obviously. But there's many interesting topics still coming up, questions to be answered. So I'm looking forward, I can talk about that later a bit more. I'm looking forward very much to continue working on that. But for now, I would say thanks for your attention. I'm looking forward to any questions.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Bjarne. That was, I think, a really very interesting tour de force of all that you've been working on, and really also, I think you're maybe downplaying a little bit even the data challenges that you're facing in trying to work on this very difficult set of questions. To get data to answer this set of questions is very difficult. So I applaud you, and I think that certainly this represents strong headway in this direction. I am looking at the Q&A and don't see any questions yet, so I'm going to take my prerogative as moderator to ask you a question or two. But in the meantime, while I'm doing that, if folks could please go ahead and add your questions into the chat. If you have any issues doing so, you can also direct questions to the organizers, and we'll try to get you online as soon as we can. So I think you made a pretty convincing case that the reduction in interest rate driven by macro factors was playing a role in the reduction in costs of capital in the renewable energy finance world over the last 10 years or so. And I was going to ask, what kind of interactions does that type of policy have with, say, not policy, but I guess that backdrop have with, you know, does it advantage renewables over fossil fuels in a systemic way? Because of the high cost of capital in both industries, but I wonder if just the cost structure in renewable energy leads to a scenario in which macro policies actually indirectly translate into renewable energy support.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So being an economist by education, I should probably answer, it depends. And indeed, it does. So the first thing I think which makes a big difference here is what energy system are we looking at, or what is kind of the starting position. And we have the situation in most of Europe, and I think most of the US, for instance, as well, that in electricity, what's competing, that's actually the new build of renewable energy projects. So that's plants that are not there yet and that are newly being built. And so the investment cost matter, and the financing of that, obviously. And these plants are competing not so much with new build of fossil fuel-based plants, of coal plants, which there's very few in the pipeline, and gas plants, there's a bit more. But they're competing also with existing plants and with the operating cost only of existing plants. And in this situation, indeed, I think the cost of capital has a very big impact on the competitiveness of renewables. And I think the situation that we saw over the last 6 to 8 years or so, with low and general interest rates getting ever lower, that was a big part of the success story of solar and wind deployment. Yeah. As soon as these markups that you had on renewables, like the additional cost of capital for the risks that will still be involved in these technologies being a new technology, as soon as these markups came down, and there was enough experience and learning on these technologies, in the financing of these technologies, that this mattered. Yeah. So I think in this case, this helped a lot. If you look at developing countries, for instance, a lot of the emerging markets as well, there the competition, it's more between new build of renewable energies and new build of conventional energies. And in these situations, also for the conventional plants, you have a part of the cost, which is upfront investment, which needs to be financed. And so this difference in capital intensity isn't that big anymore. And so the general interest rate level doesn't maybe make so much more of a difference anymore. And then the difference in the markups, so the difference in, do you have a risk premium for renewables, or do you have maybe also a risk premium for fossil fuels? That's even more important. And I think that's what in some developing country contexts makes renewable energy projects quite expensive. We have very long-term capital commitment, and there's country environments where that just comes at a very high cost. And I think in those countries, it's maybe less the general interest rate level which needs attention, but more how to get down the risk and how to have de-risking from financial side, also from policy side, to get down these markups to improve the competitiveness of renewables. Yeah.
Terrific. Well, thank you. Certainly, I think that should shape our thinking about what the future might hold as well. I'm going to turn now to Katrina Yu's question, which is, what are some of the research questions you think are understudied because of the lack or the difficulty of accessing the data?
Pretty much everything related to renewable energy science, I would say. No, not everything, but I think this relates to certain region and certain technologies where we have even less data than for others, for instance. So if we stay with the topics that are talked about now a lot, so the question, okay, project finance for utility scale projects in wind or in solar. I think for those technologies, we are now in a situation for a couple of the big OECD countries. We have data which is available, which became available during the last few years or so. And so we understand where do the costs stand. We have an initial idea how different policies impact that and so on. But we don't have that at all for a lot of other countries. So we have that already in Europe. If you go to Eastern Europe countries, we have some countries which have super high cost of capital for wind projects, for instance. That's what you hear from the market, but there's very little understanding of, okay, where would they be? Why are they so high? Why don't we see, because we don't see projects then because they are so high, and so we also can't learn from the projects. But it would be really important to understand that, I think, because that's the only way how to make these projects reality. And that applies for much of the developing world as well. So there is data on countries where the World Bank with the Scaling Solar Program, for instance, went in at large scale, but a lot of other countries we know little. And even more so than for other technologies. I think that's one thing I had on my Outlook picture. What we started working on is electrification technologies, for instance, or energy access technologies. If you look at mini grids or solar home systems and these types of technologies, what's the role of the financing cost for one technology being built in one country and maybe not in another country? How could you change that? I think that's another area where data is really missing. Yeah.
Great. So we have another question from Philip Eris, who's the editor of Joule, and he has asked, can you comment on the financing of renewable energy projects in China? And I might add to that, other developing countries, if you feel more comfortable speaking on that. And what are the renewable energy implications, I guess, in terms of scaling, in terms of new technology development of Chinese approaches to financing?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I fear I can't say too much about that. So I'm aware that in China, project finance plays a big role. This is project finance is structured and underwritten by Chinese banks. You also have commercially financed projects, large projects, which are financed by the off-taker in a way, which is like a commercial investment for on-site use. So I think this is what I can say. I'm not in the details on the Chinese renewable energy finance market, unfortunately. I can say a bit about other emerging markets where a bit more of an insight maybe. One characteristic that some of these markets have, for instance, Brazil, when it was still a big renewable investment market, came down a bit. It's I very briefly mentioned it's the important role of public banks in there. So it could be multilateral development banks, but it could also be state investment banks, which to some degree might then also prescribe the financing structures being used. For instance, in Brazil, that's something which is also controversial. There's the big state investment bank BNDES. They kind of offer preferential loans to renewable energy projects, but only if you realize them in project finance structures, which has certain advantages because it gives transparency, it reduces agency conflicts also between lenders and owners and the projects, because it's very transparent if you have one project, one SPV per project only. But it might exclude some financiers, and it might also further increase the role that banks play and reduce the role that other stakeholders play, which might have a bigger say in other financing structures.
Great. I have another question here also on this topic of the global financing backdrop. So the question is from Jorge Izar, and it asks, can you please comment on the biases that some of the financial institutions currently have, like whether those have implications in terms of racial or cultural or other types of inequalities? And so he explains that he's thinking here about how different indicators could favor the financing of countries in the global south versus the Western world. And I think his main point is, how do you ensure equitable financing across these project options and opportunities?
Yeah, this is a super relevant question, I think, because if we talk about what the question called the global south, I would say developing countries, is that often you have projects realized in a regulatory environment which is maybe less stringent in some aspects and less used to take into account the needs and effects on population in the region where these projects are being realized. And so whoever is involved in financing or realizing this project might play a bigger role, their decisions, in equity outcomes, for instance, as compared to government agencies. Also, yeah. I would say that the emerging typical renewable energy financing structures that you see worldwide, they give a big role to banks. They give a big role to public banks, particularly to multilateral, but also to bilateral development banks, to commercial banks, which are active in these countries to some extent. And this role can be filled out in different ways, right? So I think there's examples which had outcomes that prioritized, for instance, cheap electricity over a lot of other needs, and then affected maybe population in different geographies within countries to very different extent. It's pretty much the same story that we saw like over the last decades with big hydro dams. But there's also examples where these banks put a lot of effort into trying to realizing projects in a way with a lot of co-benefits for different groups of society. You know, one example that would come to my mind there is in Morocco, in the Massen structure that's used for public and private kind of mixed financing of large solar PV and solar thermal projects, where there's guidelines that are brought up by development banks that require that always a certain share of the investment sum is used for local education on the project sites, for creating jobs, which are not only in the construction phase, but which also persist over the lifetime of the project and so on. And it's really partly the banks that drive this. So I think it can be filled in different ways. And to the extent that it's public banks involved, it really depends on their mandate then, and on the policy that that steers these banks. And policymakers, in the end, they can't hide so much then, I think, and say, okay, it's the banks and it's not us, but also these banks, they act with a certain mandate. And the public banks, they're super important. And if you want to change the outcomes of the projects, I say you would have to change the mandate of the banks.
Great. We have a question from Quinn Cooney, which is asking about a relationship. Is there a relationship between renewable energy investments and energy efficiency investments, like building retrofits or HVAC improvements that you have noticed during your research? And I might extend that question also to batteries. If batteries and renewable energy efficiency investments can be are subject to some of the same dynamics on the financing side that you're seeing for renewables.
Yeah, I mean, overall we see much more dynamic development in renewable energy finance compared to energy efficiency investments. I mean, energy efficiency, it's very broad, right? It comes from like some household insulation to like industrial processes. But one of the reasons for that, why we see so much much more dynamics in renewable energy finance as compared to energy efficiency finance, is that from a financing point of view, renewables, they're just great because they are quite comparable. So the output of such projects is always electricity, right? Technologies, they are relatively standardized. Solar PV, it's super standardized. It's the same modules being used everywhere. It's pretty much inverters. It's a global commodity as well. For wind turbines, it's not that standardized. There's different turbines being used in different geographies. But then at the end of the day, these projects, they are similar enough that it's easy to standardize the financing and compile that into packages which are interesting for very large investors, then like institutional investors, which start investing from 50 millions, and they can go in a portfolio of 50 millions of solar PV. That's no problem, or wind farm. Whereas for energy efficiency, this is very heterogeneous projects. There's individual conditions on the ground, the risk structure of these efficiency projects. And we know that from a lot of economics literature is also the outcomes of efficiency projects, whether you eventually see the savings that you planned initially, whether you actually see them realized later on. There's a big risk involved in that. And so the risk structure of these projects, that's just very different from project to project. So from a financing point of view, it's much more difficult to standardize that, to package that in a way that you have low transaction cost. It's almost impossible for an institutional investor to invest into energy efficiency, whereas it's super easy to invest into solar or wind. And also I think that's one of the challenges why we see less dynamic for energy efficiency, and why also from a policy point of view, I mean, even if you look at these state investment banks that I just talked about, they also have activities in energy efficiency, but that's typically more of a subsidy program then, or like concessional loans. So this is where you work more with transfers, where you work with standards, obviously, because using finance as a policy instrument is, I would say, just more difficult for energy efficiency.
Great. Well, we're just about at time, and so with the sort of final 30 seconds to a minute, we have just one last question, which fuses a question we've gotten from Amanda Graham in the audience with one that I have for you, which is, if you are stuck in an elevator with a bunch of undergraduates, how would you get them excited about the next projects that you're planning in renewable energy finance research?
Yeah, I think first, I think renewable energy per se is exciting. I think it's the future. I think we need much more of it for a carbon neutral world. This will be like 100-fold of what we have now. And the question is, how should we pay for it? And having an answer on that, I think was one of the key hurdles to take. And whatever helps with that answer, I find it super exciting. And I hope many others as well.
Terrific. Well, I think after this talk, I think I'm sure you've convinced me. And at this point, I'd like to, first of all, thank you so much. I think that was really enlightening. And I'm going to turn it over now for the last 5 minutes to Elizabeth to have a couple announcements.
Well, for both of you guys, thank you so much for participating in this series and really making and bringing to light high-level issues and very, very current research. That's incredibly important for the future. So we look forward to hearing more from both of you in the future. And thank you, Valerie, for hosting this session. We really appreciate that too. I want to invite everybody watching as well. I mean, this is a new series. We're looking for young researchers to speak and young researchers to participate. So if you have any topic you'd like to talk about, I'm just elizabeth@dartmouth.edu. Feel free to email me. And then Stephanie, could you share the slide of upcoming events, please? We have some events that we have here at Dartmouth, and then the next event in this series is in 2 weeks, same bat time. This list of topics are ones that we're working on. The next energy conversation series is with Pars Vishna from Carnegie Mellon, which is about electrify everything, which fits really well with today's talk when we're thinking about this. So this first series on cooperative electric cooperatives, thinking about energy finance, and then electrifying everything is a really nice run up as we go forward. But we're also looking at, and then the next one is July 15th with Rebecca Sias from Columbia University. So but between that, though, we have another one, and Bjarne, I'd love to have you come and weigh in on that one too, on thinking about energy stimulus investing and investing in the electric power grid of the future. And the last question I want to leave you with, the last word, is if you were to have a packet of policies, what would your proposals look like to be able to stimulate renewable energy in a country like the US?
Is that to me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, if I could put together a wish list for policies in the finance sphere. Developed world, it's quite amazing where we now stand with financing for solar PV and for wind. So I think this is a lot has been achieved there, and a lot is being deployed also, and this kind of is, I feel it's a move that doesn't stop so much so soon again. So my wish list then would probably to put effort in conducive policies, including finance policies for those technologies which aren't there yet, but that we will also need. So like the next big things is if we would come out of this COVID-19 recovery with, for instance, Europe having brought electrolyzers and other hydrogen technologies down the learning curve in a way that they are competitive to fossil fuel-based solutions in industry and part of transport and so on. And the US may be having deployed carbon capture and storage on a scale that the abatement costs are on a much lower level as they are now. So bring these new technologies which aren't there yet, where we have solar and wind, to the same level. I think this would be on top of my wish list, giving a lot of momentum for the next phase of the energy transition then, and to actually reaching those decarbonization that we need for a climate pathway that's sustainable. and for which solar and wind surely won't be enough.
And we're right at 7, or we're right at 1 o'clock. So thank you so much for your time today, Valerie. Super big thank you to you too. And we'll see you guys all in 2 weeks. And remember, send your names. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.